The story of the Shang Dynasty doesn't start with bronze bells ringing or kings building palaces. It begins in a haze, part legend, part memory, part truth half buried in time. The Chinese themselves, when they looked back, didn't always draw a hard line between myth and history. They spoke of the Xia, the dynasty before the Shang, as if it had truly existed, though for centuries even modern historians debated whether it was real or only a fable. To them, the Xia represented the first step, the prototype of kingship, and its fall opened the stage for a new power to take hold. That power was the Shang. But think about it, how does one dynasty rise out of the shadow of another? It's not as clean as the neat timelines we read in textbooks. Real life is messy. While the Xia supposedly collapsed under corruption and cruelty, some clans and warlords would have survived, carrying their weapons, their gods, their grudges. One of those clans, the Shang, was already sharpening its identity, gathering its followers, and waiting for the moment when chaos could be turned into opportunity. The transition wasn't just political. It was cultural, almost spiritual. Ancient Chinese storytellers wove the shift in dynasties into morality plays. When rulers forgot virtue, heaven revoked their mandate. It's a powerful idea, isn't it? The world itself seemed to say, enough, you're unfit to rule. The Shang's rise was remembered through that lens, as if cosmic justice had personally chosen them to replace the fading Xia. And even today, when people talk about the mandate of heaven, they're echoing a framework that was shaped during this dim, early handoff. Of course, legends don't sprout out of thin air. Archaeology offers hints, traces of walled settlements, layers of bronze artifacts, and ritual remains that suggest organized societies long before the Shang kings ruled from Anyang. Were those the Xia? Or Proto-Shang? Or both overlapping? Scholars argue, but one thing feels certain: the Shang didn't just appear one day. They emerged from centuries of small tribes learning to farm, to fight, to worship, to record. Let me explain it in another way. Picture a river after a storm. The old banks are washed out, but the water keeps flowing, carving new channels. That's what happened between Xia and Shang. The human currents, farmers, artisans, priests, warriors, kept moving, and eventually they pulled behind the leaders strong enough, ruthless enough, and persuasive enough to claim they were not just chiefs, but kings. And the stories preserved from those days? They're colored with drama. One tale describes Jia, the last Xia ruler, as a tyrant so cruel he forced laborers to dig massive lakes of wine just for his own indulgence. Another tells of Tang, the founder of the Shang, rising up as a kind of liberator, his rebellion painted in moral hues. Was Tang really so benevolent? Or was he just the lucky warlord who seized the moment? We may never know. What we do know is that his story became part of the origin myth, the just conqueror overthrowing a corrupt dynasty. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern that repeats again and again in Chinese history. The Shang didn't just inherit land, they inherited a narrative. And that narrative mattered because it justified their claim. When people believed that the Xia had collapsed under the weight of its own sins, they were more willing to see the Shang as heaven's answer. Even in times when life was still brutal, when farming was uncertain and war was constant, the story of divine approval gave shape to their reality. If you were a villager back then, living through that transition, you probably didn't think in terms of dynasties. You thought in terms of who demanded your tribute, whose soldiers came to conscript your sons, whose priests led the sacrifices to the ancestors. But you would have felt the tremor of change. Old rulers fading, new ones rising. And maybe you would have whispered those stories by the fire, how the Xia grew cruel, how the Shang rose righteous. Because even if you weren't sure what was true, the stories explain the chaos around you. And that's where the Shang story really begins, not in bronze, not in writing, but in whispered legends of decline and ascent. When the fog of legend starts to clear, one figure steps into focus: Tang of Shang. His name carries the weight of a founder, a man remembered not only as a conqueror, but also as someone who redefined what it meant to rule. Tang wasn't just a warlord with a lucky streak. He became the archetype, the one the Shang people looked back to when they needed to remember why their dynasty had the right to exist. Tang didn't rise in a vacuum. Before him, The Shang were already a tribal power, known for their skill in agriculture, their control of bronze production, and their fierce fighters. They weren't yet kings, but they weren't insignificant either. The Xia rulers, if we accept the stories about them, had grown complacent, weighed down by indulgence and corruption. Jia, the last Xia king, is remembered as a tyrant who cared more about pleasure than the welfare of his people. To later historians, that made Tang's rebellion not only practical but morally necessary. But here's where the story gets interesting. Tang didn't position himself as a usurper hungry for power. He cast himself as heaven's instrument. He claimed that the Xia had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine seal of approval that justified kingship. And in claiming that heaven now smiled upon him, Tang gave his war a cosmic purpose. It wasn't just tribes clashing. It was heaven correcting the balance of the world. Now, think about the genius in that move. In an age where people truly believed their ancestors watched over them, where oracles spoke through cracked bones and the will of the spirits guided decisions, claiming heaven's mandate wasn't abstract, it was powerful. It gave Tang's cause legitimacy, rallying not just his warriors, but also the hearts of those weary of Xia rule. It's a bit like a modern political leader using the language of destiny or justice to frame their campaign. The difference? Back then, people didn't just see it as rhetoric. They saw it as literal truth. Tang's rise wasn't bloodless, of course. He gathered allies, outmaneuvered rivals, and eventually launched a campaign against Jia. The decisive battle, though blurred by centuries of retelling, became the turning point. Tang's forces defeated Jia's, and the Shang were no longer just a tribe. They were rulers. Jia was said to have fled into exile, a disgraced monarch stripped of heaven's favor, while Tang stood as the new son of heaven. What fascinates me is how Tang managed to balance might with mercy, at least in the stories told about him. Unlike the cruel Jia, Tang was remembered as benevolent, someone who reduced taxes, respected the people, and made sacrifices to honor both heaven and earth. Was this propaganda? Probably. But propaganda that lasts thousands of years is still powerful. His rule set the stage for how later dynasties would present their own founding moments: a moral rebellion, a divinely justified conquest, a new beginning. There's another detail worth noticing. Tang didn't erase the past completely. Instead, he absorbed elements of Xia tradition and ritual into Shang practice. That's clever politics. By linking the new dynasty to the old, even while condemning its corruption, Tang wove continuity into change. People didn't feel like they were starting from scratch. They felt like they were continuing a tradition, only under a ruler who actually deserved the throne. Imagine being in Tang's camp after the victory. The air thick with the smell of bronze weapons cooling after battle. Priests preparing sacrifices to thank the ancestors for favoring their cause. Warriors, exhausted but exultant, knowing they had just fought in a battle that would be told and retold for centuries. The sense of destiny must have been palpable. People don't often get to feel like they're at the beginning of something monumental, but Tang's followers surely did. And just like that, the Shang Dynasty wasn't a rumor or a dream. It was real, standing on the shoulders of Tang's victory, carrying forward the mandate that Jia had squandered. Tang became not just a founder, but a symbol, a reminder that power was sacred when wielded justly and fragile when abused. That spark, lit by Tang, would burn for centuries. Tang's victory may have been the spark, but sparks can fizzle unless they're fed. That's where the early Shang rulers earned their place in history. They didn't just bask in Tang's glory, they got to work, turning a rebel victory into a functioning dynasty. It's one thing to conquer, it's another to govern. And the Shang, right from their beginnings, seemed to understand that the longevity of their rule would depend on more than swords and chariots. The first task? Building order, literally and figuratively. Across the Shang lands, early rulers commissioned the construction of walls. These weren't just military defenses, though they certainly kept raiders at bay. They were symbols. A wall carved out the boundary of a city, marking it as a place of power, a place where Shang authority held sway. To walk past such a wall was to be reminded, every day, that the Shang were not just leaders of men, but keepers of the land. Roads followed. And roads, as simple as they sound, are the skeleton of any state. Without them, Armies can't move quickly, trade stalls, and communication fractures. The early Shang invested in those pathways, connecting scattered settlements into something closer to a unified territory. Can you imagine the shift for a farmer or craftsman who suddenly found himself connected to distant places, able to trade or travel under the protection of Shang rule? What had once been a patchwork of isolated tribes started to feel like part of a larger whole. But the rulers didn't stop at walls and roads. They built administrative order, too. We can only piece this together from fragments, oracle bones, archaeological digs, but what emerges is a picture of hierarchy. Kings at the top, of course, with their ritual and military authority. Below them, nobles and clan leaders who managed specific territories, gathering tribute and providing soldiers when needed. At the base, farmers and laborers, whose work kept everything else afloat. It was a pyramid, and like all pyramids, it depended on the stability of its base. The early Shang also leaned heavily on ritual to glue this order together. It wasn't enough to collect taxes or build walls. They needed people to believe in their legitimacy. So ceremonies became central: sacrifices to ancestors, rituals of divination, and displays of bronze vessels so ornate they dazzled the eye. These rituals weren't side notes, they were the heart of Shang authority. To govern was to perform, to show that the Shang weren't just ruling by might, but by heaven's will. Here's the thing: without that balance between force and faith, the Shang might have fallen apart within a generation. But by embedding their rule into both infrastructure and spirituality, they created a system resilient enough to outlast individual kings. You could remove one ruler, but the walls still stood, the roads still stretched across the land, and the rituals still bound the people together. And we shouldn't overlook the human element. Early rulers weren't just bureaucrats, they were personalities. Each had to manage nobles who were powerful in their own right, to command loyalty while allowing enough autonomy to keep them invested. Too much control and the nobles would revolt. Too little and the dynasty would fracture. That delicate dance of central authority versus local power, well, it's one of those eternal struggles of governance. You can see it replayed in medieval Europe, in feudal Japan, in empires across the globe. Every dynasty that lasts learns that lesson early: order doesn't come from conquest alone. It comes from creating structures, physical, political, and spiritual, that make people accept, even rely on, your rule. The Shang grasped that truth, and the early kings wasted little time hammering it into reality. So, when you picture the first decades after Tang, don't imagine endless feasting and celebrations. Imagine laborers sweating under the sun as walls rose stone by stone. Imagine carts carrying goods along newly cleared paths. Imagine priests chanting before newly built altars, smoke curling into the air as a sign to the ancestors. That's what Shang order looked like, not abstract but lived, seen, walked on, and remembered. And slowly, the Shang weren't just the dynasty that replaced the Xia. They were becoming the dynasty that defined what rulership in China could be. If you really want to understand why the Shang dynasty mattered, you've got to look at bronze. Not just as an alloy of copper and tin, but as the lifeblood of Shang society. To the modern eye, bronze might seem quaint, overshadowed by the later brilliance of iron and steel. But for the Shang, bronze was everything: weapon, art, money, magic. It was the substance that turned a tribal kingdom into a civilization. Let's start with war, because war was never far away. Bronze weapons were sharper, stronger, and deadlier than anything made of stone or bone. A bronze-tipped spear could pierce through armor. A bronze axe could cleave through shields. And in the hands of trained soldiers, those weapons weren't just tools of battle, they were symbols of Shang dominance. Picture a battlefield where chariots rolled like thunder, their axles reinforced, their riders wielding bronze-tipped halberds. Against such power, enemies armed with lesser tools didn't stand a chance. But bronze wasn't only about who could win a fight. It was about who controlled the sources of copper and tin. These weren't materials you could dig up in just any backyard. They came from distant mines, and managing that supply meant controlling trade routes, labor forces, and alliances. Bronze smelting required organization, quarries, furnaces, skilled metallurgists. It's no exaggeration to say that whoever held bronze held power. The The Shang kings understood this, and they guarded their foundries like modern states guard nuclear technology. Here's the thing, though, bronze wasn't just military hardware. It was spiritual. The Shang poured their craftsmanship into vessels, massive cauldrons, elegant wine cups, intricate containers used in rituals. These weren't practical kitchenware. They were offerings to ancestors, symbols of wealth and legitimacy. The surfaces were covered with mysterious designs, tie-dye masks with staring eyes, dragons twisting into impossible shapes. Were these decorations purely artistic? Or did they embody spirits meant to protect and empower the dynasty? Scholars still debate, but one thing's certain, a bronze vessel in a Shang ritual wasn't just an object. It was a bridge between the living and the dead. Now, imagine standing in one of those ceremonies. A king pours wine into a bronze cup, the liquid shimmering as it catches the light. Priests chant, drums beat, and the vessel itself gleams with patterns that seem alive in the flickering firelight. To participants, the bronze didn't just hold wine, it held power, memory, and divine approval. In a sense, bronze was the dynasty itself, cast into metal. And here's a curious twist. Bronze was also a form of wealth, though not in the way we think of coins and paper money. Owning bronze vessels was like having a fortune in your household. They were status symbols, heirlooms passed down, proof that your family had a direct link to the ruling order. A noble without bronze was a noble without legitimacy. So while the common folk farmed millet and raised pigs, the elites measured their prosperity in weighty, shining vessels of bronze. If we step back, it's striking how similar this is to other ancient civilizations. The Egyptians had their gold, the Mesopotamians their ziggurats, the Greeks their marble temples. The Shang? They had bronze. It was their calling card, their identity, their proof that they belonged in the pantheon of great early civilizations. And yet, bronze came with a cost. Smelting and casting required forests for fuel, labor for mining, and endless coordination. The very thing that gave the Shang power also tied them to a fragile system of resources. If trade faltered, if mines dried up, if laborers rebelled, the bronze lifeline could snap. In that sense, their strength contained the seeds of weakness. It's a pattern we see repeated across history, empires leaning so heavily on one resource that it becomes their undoing. Still, in the height of their power, the Shang turned bronze into something larger than life. They transformed metal into myth. They cast their authority not just in words, but in vessels that still survive today, sitting in museums with a strange gravity that draws you in. Look at one long enough, and you can almost hear the echoes of drums, chants, and firelight. Bronze made the Shang eternal. Even if their dynasty eventually fell, their vessels outlived them. So yes, bronze was metal. But to the Shang, it was also magic, weapon, and wealth, three pillars holding up their world. If bronze was the muscle of the Shang dynasty, oracle bones were the nervous system, the way the Shang communicated with forces beyond the human world. To us, they look like cracked shells and animal bones, etched with strange marks. But to the Shang, these weren't just bones, they were conversations with their ancestors and with heaven itself. Let's set the scene. You're standing in a Shang temple, smoke heavy in the air from burning offerings. A priest steps forward, holding a flat piece of ox scapula or a turtle plastron, the two most common canvases for divination. The surface has already been polished, and tiny pits have been carved into it. The king himself might be present because these ceremonies weren't minor affairs. When the Shang asked questions of the spirits, they asked big ones. Should we go to war? Will the crops grow this season? Is the queen's pregnancy blessed? The bone or shell is placed over fire, and as the heat builds, it cracks. Those cracks aren't random to the Shang, they're messages. The diviner studies the patterns, sometimes like a reader tracing lines in a palm, sometimes like an astronomer reading the stars. And then comes the inscription. A scribe carves the question into the bone. Will it rain next week? Will we defeat the enemy? Will the harvest be good? Alongside it, they sometimes carve the interpretation, auspicious, not auspicious. And, in some cases, they later record the outcome. Indeed, it rained. Can you see what's happening here? This isn't just superstition, it's the earliest form of Chinese writing and one of the earliest continuous writing systems in the world. Those etched questions, scratched into bones thousands of years ago, are the ancestors of the characters still written in China today. When we talk about continuity of culture, this is what we mean. A farmer in Anyang whispering a prayer through a diviner's bone and a student in Beijing writing Chinese characters are part of the same story, stretched across millennia. But let's not overlook the emotional core. Imagine being a Shang farmer, your survival tied to weather you couldn't control. The sky looked as unpredictable then as it does now, but you had no satellites, no Doppler radar. What you had was the king and his diviners, men who claimed they could ask your ancestors for guidance. That must have offered reassurance. Even if the cracks on the bone couldn't guarantee rain, they at least made the world feel a little less random, a little more connected to human hopes. Here's the fascinating part. These inscriptions don't just tell us about rituals. They tell us about life. We learn that Shang kings worried about toothaches, about hunts, about eclipses, about births. The questions weren't always grand, they were human. That makes the oracle bones a time capsule of anxiety, ambition, and wonder. The bones preserve not just words but feelings, fear of famine, hope for victory, desire for reassurance. And think of the ripple effect. Because writing began as divination, the act of recording was sacred. Writing wasn't for shopping lists or idle doodles, it was a bridge to the ancestors. That reverence for writing carried into later Chinese culture, where calligraphy itself became an art form and written words carried spiritual weight. The Shang may not have imagined that their bone scratches would echo into eternity, but they did. Let me add a twist. The bones also reveal how much the Shang kings leaned on ritual to govern. Decisions weren't presented as arbitrary. They were framed as heaven's will, interpreted through cracks and ink. That gave their commands legitimacy. A war wasn't just the king's choice, it was sanctioned by the ancestors. A harvest wasn't just luck, it was foretold. In that sense, oracle bones weren't just divination, they were political tools, strengthening the king's authority by binding it to the spiritual realm. And the drama of it all, fire hissing, bones cracking, priests chanting, must have left an impression. For common people watching, it was proof that their rulers weren't ordinary men. They were the intermediaries between the living and the dead. That image stuck, shaping the very idea of kingship in China for centuries. So when you look at an oracle bone in a museum case today, don't just see a cracked piece of shell. See it as a diary entry of a dynasty, a nervous question asked in firelight, an early line in the story of writing, and a glimpse of how the Shang made sense of a world that could feel both terrifying and full of wonder. Here's the thing about being a Shang king, you weren't just a ruler who collected tribute, commanded armies, and issued decrees. You were also a performer on the grandest stage imaginable, a stage that stretched from earth to heaven. Kingship wasn't only political, it was theatrical, drenched in ritual, designed to show the people that the king wasn't merely a man but a bridge between worlds. Think of it this way, every act of governance had a ritual attached. The king didn't just announce a war, he divined whether the ancestors approved. He didn't simply celebrate a harvest, he performed sacrifices to thank the spirits for it. Even disasters like droughts or floods weren't just natural misfortunes, they were warnings, signs that the king's performance was faltering, that heaven's script was displeased. If crops withered or enemies triumphed, people didn't necessarily blame bad luck, they wondered whether the king had lost heaven's favor. That's a lot of pressure, isn't it? Every decision doubled as a test of divine approval. Ceremony was constant. The king might stand before massive bronze vessels, their surfaces gleaming with sacred designs, and pour libations of wine into the earth. He would preside over sacrifices, sometimes of animals, sometimes, grimly, of humans, offering blood as the ultimate gift to the ancestors. The rituals weren't hidden in private corners, they were spectacles meant to be seen, heard, and felt. Drums thundered, chants echoed, smoke curled into the sky. The audience wasn't just the nobles in attendance, but also the spirits they believed hovered around them, watching closely. And in these performances, the king wasn't acting for his own sake. He was enacting a cosmic drama, the renewal of ties between the living and the dead, the reaffirmation that the Shang throne stood at the center of the universe's order. To participate in these ceremonies was to reinforce the belief that society's hierarchy mirrored heaven's hierarchy. Just as ancestors ruled from above, the Shang king ruled on earth. Honestly, what fascinates me most is how effective this theater must have been. Imagine being a farmer, invited into the city for a great sacrifice. You'd walk through towering walls, past guards with bronze weapons, and into a ritual ground filled with sound and smoke. At the center, your king, dressed in finery you could never dream of, spoke words that weren't his own but claimed to be messages from the ancestors. Could you doubt his authority in that moment? The spectacle itself was the proof. Of course, it wasn't all for show. These rituals bound the nobility to the throne. Nobles who attended sacrifices weren't just spectators, they were participants, bringing offerings, pledging loyalty, and being reminded of their subordinate place in the cosmic order. Ritual was political glue, keeping ambitious lords tied to the king's authority. Without it, Shang power might have fractured much earlier. And here's a paradox worth chewing on. The king's role was both exalted and fragile. Exalted, because he alone could perform certain rituals that maintained cosmic balance. Fragile, because if he failed, if heaven seemed displeased, his legitimacy crumbled. Ritual gave him power, but it also chained him to performance. You might say Shang kingship was like walking a tightrope between divinity and disaster. Theater, sacrifice, spectacle, this was the rhythm of Shang power. And it worked. It kept the dynasty's authority not only in the hands of men with weapons, but also in the hearts of people who believed their ruler was heaven's chosen actor on Earth's stage. Up until now, we've lingered in palaces and ritual grounds, listening to kings speak to ancestors and priests read the cracks of bones. But let's be honest, that was only one slice of Shang society. Behind the bronze vessels and the grandeur of ritual stood the countless hands that made it all possible. The farmers tilling millet fields, the artisans hammering bronze, the slaves forced into grueling labor. Without them, there would have been no Shang Dynasty to admire. Start with the farmers. Their world was the soil, not the throne room. They raised millet as the staple grain, grew wheat and barley where the land allowed, and kept pigs, dogs, and chickens close to home. Water buffalo and oxen worked alongside them, pulling plows through stubborn earth. Farming wasn't glamorous, but it was everything. Without reliable harvests, no amount of ritual could sustain the dynasty. And farming wasn't just about food, it was about tribute. A portion of what farmers produced fed the elite, filled granaries, and supported armies. The rhythm of their lives was tied directly to the survival of the state. Then came the artisans, whose skills gave the Shang their cultural edge. Think about the bronze casters, the potters, the jade workers. These weren't simple craftsmen, they were specialists, trained in techniques so advanced that even today archaeologists marvel at the precision. Bronze, in particular, was a team effort. Mining, smelting, casting, it required coordination on a massive scale. An artisan might spend weeks creating a clay mold, carving intricate designs into it, only to see it destroyed in the casting process. Their reward? A vessel that glowed with power and prestige, destined for ritual use or a noble household. Artisans also gave the Shang their aesthetic signature. Jade carvings, polished smooth and shaped into ornaments or ritual tools, weren't just beautiful, they were spiritual, connecting the living to the dead. Pottery, though more practical, carried its own artistry, used in daily meals but also in burials. In short, artisans turned raw materials into meaning, embedding the Shang worldview into every object they touched. And then, there were the slaves. It's impossible to romanticize their lives. Many were captives of war, taken from defeated tribes, stripped of freedom, and forced into the hardest labor. Some were sacrificed in rituals, their blood offered as the ultimate gift to the ancestors. Others worked in fields, quarries, or construction projects, their labor fueling the machinery of Shang society. They stood at the bottom of the hierarchy, reminders that the glory of the dynasty rested on suffering as well as achievement. It's easy, reading about dynasties, to focus on kings and nobles. But pause for a moment and imagine life as a Shang farmer. The crack of dawn, fields stretching endlessly before you, your back aching as you bend to plant millet. You know that much of what you harvest won't stay with your family, it will go to the rulers, to the rituals, to the soldiers. Yet you endure, because survival depends on the rhythms of planting and harvest, and because Shang rule, with all its rituals and bronze splendor, has woven itself into the fabric of your world. Or picture an artisan, hands blackened from working the furnace, sweat dripping as molten bronze pours into a mold. You know the vessel you're creating isn't yours to keep, it's destined for the king's altar. But you also know that when it's unveiled, gleaming in firelight, it will carry part of your skill into immortality. And consider the slaves, bound to the will of others, with no choice but to serve. Their presence was as real as the bronze vessels and oracle bones, though their stories are often silent in the archaeological record. Yet without their toil, the walls wouldn't have stood, the roads wouldn't have stretched, and the grandeur of Shang life would have been impossible. The people beneath the palaces remind us that dynasties aren't built only on rituals and myths. They're built on labor, the quiet, relentless work of hands that sewed, carved, carried, and bled. If kingship was ritual theater, then farmers, artisans, and slaves were the stage crew who made sure the show could go on. A dynasty doesn't survive long if it stays small. The Shang rulers understood this, and from the very beginning, expansion was stitched into their story. But here's the twist: their power wasn't built purely on brute force. Conquest mattered, of course, it always does, but diplomacy, marriages, alliances, and tribute networks were just as critical. The Shang kings weren't only warriors, they were strategists, weaving a web of relationships that stretched beyond the walls of their cities. Picture the Shang heartland along the Yellow River. Fertile, rich in resources, and central to trade routes, it was both a prize and a target. Neighboring tribes constantly pushed against the Shang borders, testing their strength. To hold their ground, the Shang kings fielded armies equipped with bronze weapons and, crucially, chariots. Those two-wheeled vehicles gave them mobility and shock power that few rivals could match. Imagine a line of Shang chariots cresting over a hill, the sun glinting off bronze fittings, horses snorting, soldiers raising spears, an intimidating sight for any enemy tribe. But conquest was never just about the battlefield. Once a rival group was defeated, the Shang often turned their leaders into allies rather than erasing them entirely. A captured chief might be allowed to keep his position, so long as he swore loyalty to the Shang king, sent tribute, and provided soldiers when called upon. It was a clever system. Why waste resources crushing every opponent when you can fold them into your network? And then there was marriage diplomacy. Shang kings and nobles married daughters into rival clans and accepted brides from other groups, turning bloodlines into binding contracts. It's a pattern repeated in countless dynasties, from medieval Europe's royal marriages to the Mongol Khan's alliances. A wedding, in this context, was more than a personal union, it was a treaty, a promise that war would pause, at least for a while. Tribute added another layer. Neighboring groups brought gifts, grain, livestock, jade, even captives to the Shang court. On the surface, it looked like generosity. In reality, it was submission, a recognition of Shang's supremacy. Every tribute delivery reinforced the hierarchy, the Shang at the center, the others orbiting like lesser stars. But expansion wasn't smooth sailing. Some tribes resisted fiercely, refusing to be absorbed. Raids and skirmishes were constant, and not every Shang campaign ended in victory. The dynasty's survival depended on a delicate balance, pushing outward without stretching too thin, rewarding loyalty while punishing defiance. And sometimes, diplomacy failed. Alliances broke, rebellions flared, and the Shang had to return to the battlefield, bronze weapons in hand. Now, let's not forget the psychological side. Expansion wasn't only about land or resources, it was about legitimacy. Each new conquest or alliance proved that the Shang still had heaven's favor. Victories were recorded, celebrated in ritual, and framed as cosmic validation. Defeats, when they came, were more than embarrassing, they were signs that the king might be losing divine approval. That's why expansion had to be continuous. To stop was to stagnate, and stagnation risked looking like failure. Imagine being a border farmer during this period. One year, your fields are taxed by a local clan chief. The next, Shang soldiers march through, declaring you're now part of the dynasty. Suddenly, you owe tribute to a distant king, and priests arrive to perform rituals you've never seen before. It must have been disorienting, but it also tied you into something larger, a network that connected you to people and places you might never visit. And so the Shang grew, not into an empire in the Roman sense, but into a mosaic of conquered lands, allied tribes, and tributary networks. Each piece was different, but together, they formed a dynasty that commanded respect and fear across northern China. Expansion, through conquest and diplomacy alike, was the engine that kept the Shang moving forward. If you strip away the wars, the bronze, and the politics, what really kept the Shang together was ritual. Not just the grand ceremonies performed by kings, but the constant rhythm of offerings, chants, and sacrifices that punctuated life at every level of society. For the Shang, ritual wasn't an occasional act, it was the heartbeat of existence, the steady pulse that told them they were aligned with ancestors, spirits, and heaven itself. Sacrifice stood at the center of this rhythm, and it came in many forms. Animals, cattle, pigs, dogs, were killed to honor ancestors or seek their favor. Their blood was poured onto the earth, their bones buried in ritual pits. But sometimes, the offerings were human. Prisoners of war, slaves, or even members of the Shang's own people were buried alive, beheaded, or burned, their deaths meant to appease restless spirits or fortify the dynasty's power. Grim as it is, those sacrifices made sense to the Shang. They weren't cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a solemn exchange between the living and the divine. Music was another essential thread in the ritual fabric. Bronze bells, drums, and flutes weren't played for entertainment alone. They were instruments of communion, their tones meant to carry prayers into the unseen world. Picture a hall filled with rhythmic drumming, the low hum of bronze chimes echoing, dancers moving in precise steps, and priests chanting alongside the music. It wasn't background noise, it was the language of ritual, meant to synchronize human life with cosmic order. Even today, traces of that connection survive in how Chinese music and ceremony often blend seamlessly, as if art and devotion were never meant to be separate. Then there were the ancestral halls, spaces dedicated to the worship of forebears. These halls weren't mere shrines. They were architectural statements of lineage and legitimacy. Inside, bronze vessels gleamed on altars, each one tied to a particular ritual occasion. Incense or aromatic herbs smoldered, offerings of food and drink were laid out, and names of the dead were spoken aloud to keep their memory alive. For the Shang, ancestors weren't gone. They were active, influential, capable of blessing or cursing the living. Maintaining those halls was both a religious duty and a political one. By tending to their ancestors, the Shang rulers affirmed their right to rule in the present. Honestly, the intensity of this ritual culture is staggering. The Shang didn't separate religion from politics or the sacred from the mundane. If a king planned a military campaign, he sacrificed first. If a farmer wanted good weather, he prayed at the local altar. If a noble hosted a feast, the ritual offerings came before the food. Ritual framed everything, a constant reminder that human life was embedded in something larger. And here's something worth noticing: ritual was also a spectacle of hierarchy. The king performed the grandest sacrifices, using the largest bronze vessels, offering the greatest gifts. Nobles echoed him on a smaller scale, their ceremonies reinforcing their loyalty and their place in the chain of authority. Commoners participated too, but always in ways that affirmed the hierarchy above them. Ritual wasn't just worship, it was a system of order, visible proof of where everyone stood. Imagine being there, in an ancestral hall lit by firelight, drums thundering as a king poured wine into a gleaming cauldron. You'd smell roasted meat, see shadows dancing on bronze surfaces, hear the chants rise and fall like waves. In that moment, it wouldn't feel like theater, it would feel like the very axis of the world was turning in front of you. And that's what ritual did for the Shang. It made the invisible visible, the intangible tangible. It tied every harvest, every war, every life and death to a rhythm greater than any single person. Without that rhythm, the dynasty might have fractured. With it, the Shang beat out a steady drum of power, faith, and continuity. Dynasties rise and fall on kings and wars, sure, but day-to-day survival rested on the shoulders of ordinary people. To really feel the Shang world, you have to step outside the palaces and ritual halls and into the villages where families cooked, farmed, and raised children. That's where the rhythm of life actually played out, where millet grew in the fields, pigs snorted in pens, and kids learned how to plant, grind, and cook from parents who had done the same before them. Food sat at the heart of Shang daily life. Millet was the staple, ground into flour or boiled into porridge, sustaining families season after season. Wheat and barley had started filtering into the region too, adding variety, though millet stayed dominant. Rice was rarer in the north, but traces suggest it made appearances on elite tables. Protein came from pigs, dogs, and chickens raised close to home, while cattle and water buffalo doubled as both food and draft animals. Fish and wild game supplemented the diet when hunts were successful. And alcohol? Oh, it mattered. Fermented millet wine wasn't just for rituals. People drank it in daily life, a warming comfort after long days in the fields. Families lived in modest houses, often semi-subterranean structures dug partly into the earth, insulated against heat and cold. Roofs of wood and thatch covered them, smoke from indoor fires curling out of simple vents. Inside, spaces were small but functional, storage pits for grain, tools leaned against walls, mats for sleeping. A Shang home wasn't a place of luxury, but it was a place of continuity, where generations shared stories by firelight. Farming tools defined existence. Wooden plows, sometimes tipped with stone or bronze, were pulled by oxen. Sickles, spades, and digging sticks helped bring in harvests. They weren't flashy, but they were lifelines. Every tool carried calluses into the hands that held it. Every broken blade meant extra hardship. And because tools wore out quickly, local blacksmiths and bronze workers were always in demand, creating a kind of quiet economy around farming labor. Children weren't idle, either. From a young age, they helped in fields, tended animals, and learned the rituals of household worship. Girls often assisted their mothers with food preparation and textile work, while boys joined fathers in farming or hunting. Education wasn't about books, it was about survival skills, oral traditions, and, for a lucky few in elite households, maybe exposure to the early written characters etched on oracle bones. Daily life was also bound to the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending and weeding, autumn brought harvest, and winter was a time of scarcity and repair. Every year was a gamble: too much rain and fields flooded, too little and famine loomed. For commoners, heaven's mandate wasn't an abstract concept, it was visible in every cloudy sky and every parched furrow of land. Feasts and festivals broke up the grind. Though resources were scarce for many, communal celebrations linked to harvests or rituals gave people moments of joy. Music, dancing, and wine loosened the weight of labor, even if just for a night. These gatherings reinforced bonds, reminding people that they weren't just surviving as isolated families, but as part of a wider community under Shang authority. It's easy to think of the Shang in terms of kings and bronzes, but pause for a second and picture the small things: the smell of millet porridge simmering in a clay pot, the clatter of wooden tools in the fields, the soft murmur of parents teaching their children how to grind grain or tie bundles. That was the real soundtrack of the dynasty. Without those hands and voices, the Shang story would never have existed at all. When we talk about the Shang, one of the most remarkable legacies is their writing. Think about it: scraps of questions on bones, etched by firelight, evolving into the very characters that people in China still use today. That continuity is staggering. Most ancient scripts, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, faded into silence. But the Shang scribes were planting seeds that never stopped growing. At first glance, those early characters on oracle bones look rough. The strokes are uneven, the forms awkward. But stare a little longer and patterns emerge. A line here resembles the horns of an ox. Another mimics a stalk of grain. A set of lines suggests a human figure kneeling. The writing was pictographic, symbols drawn from life itself. Over time, those pictures hardened into abstractions, becoming less literal and more stylized, easier to reproduce quickly and consistently. The Shang didn't use writing for everything, though. It wasn't scribbled on clay tablets to track every bushel of grain like in Mesopotamia. For them, writing was sacred. It belonged to the realm of the ancestors, the questions asked in ritual. That sacredness gave the act of writing enormous weight. Every carved character wasn't just communication, it was invocation. To inscribe something on bone or shell was to place it directly into the eternal record of heaven's gaze. But even in this restricted form, writing served practical needs. Kings could record their concerns, track patterns, and build an archive of divine consultation. Over time, these records accumulated into something more, a history. The Shang may not have thought of themselves as historians, but they were documenting events, anxieties, and outcomes in a way that future generations could read. That's how we know today that a Shang king once worried about his toothache or asked the ancestors whether rain would bless his crops. Writing, in a sense, preserved their humanity. Here's what fascinates me. Once writing exists, it changes everything. Oral tradition can be forgotten, twisted, or lost with the death of a storyteller. But carved characters endure. They anchor memory, turning fleeting moments into something fixed. For the Shang, that meant their rituals gained permanence. It also meant their authority could be reinforced over time. If an oracle bone said the ancestors had approved a decision, who could argue? The record itself carried divine weight. Of course, literacy wasn't widespread. Only a handful of scribes and priests learned the art of carving symbols. That exclusivity made writing a tool of power. To know the script was to hold a key that most others didn't. It's not unlike medieval Europe, where literacy was concentrated in monasteries, giving priests an outsized role in shaping society. For the Shang, scribes held a similar influence. They were keepers of knowledge, interpreters of the divine, and, in their own quiet way, the authors of history. And the script's endurance? That's where the Shang story spills beyond their own dynasty. Later Chinese characters trace their roots back to these early forms. Though they changed shape and style, the lineage is clear. The written word became one of the most unbroken cultural threads in human history. That's why when we look at an oracle bone today, scratched with jagged strokes, it's not just an artifact, it's the ancestor of every character inked in brushstrokes, printed in type, or glowing on a smartphone screen in modern China. So imagine that moment in Shang times, a priest leaning over a bone, carving strokes with deliberate care. The crackle of fire as heat spreads, the bones splitting under pressure, the characters etched alongside the fractures. The air is heavy with incense and tension. And with every cut of the blade, the priest isn't just asking a question, he's chiseling history, pushing humanity one step deeper into the written world. That's the mystery of the Shang script, born from ritual, shaped by necessity, hardened into permanence. A script that began with whispers to the ancestors ended up speaking across thousands of years. For a dynasty remembered as patriarchal and king-centered, the Shang still left us one astonishing story that cuts through the usual assumptions, the story of Fu Hao. She wasn't a passive queen sitting in the shadows of her husband's throne. She was a general, a priestess, and a political player whose presence proved that Shang society, at least at times, allowed women to wield extraordinary power. Fu Hao was one of the consorts of King Wu Ding, one of the most notable Shang rulers. At first glance, she might seem like just another royal wife, one of many in a sprawling court. But her name appears again and again on oracle bones, tied to military campaigns, rituals, and decisions of state. And that's the clue. She wasn't only living within the palace, she was commanding armies beyond it. Yes, a woman leading troops in Bronze Age China. Oracle bones record Fu Hao commanding forces of thousands, leading campaigns against rival tribes like the Chang. Imagine her standing in a chariot, bronze weapons flashing, soldiers following her into battle not simply because she was the king's wife, but because she had proven her skill. In a world where warfare decided dynasties, Fu Hao carved out her place not as a footnote, but as a strategist and warrior in her own right. Her influence wasn't confined to the battlefield. She also performed rituals, offering sacrifices to ancestors, bridging the gap between the Shang court and the divine. This dual role, general and priestess, shows just how deeply she was trusted, not only by Wu Ding but by the broader Shang elite. Few people, man or woman, held both the sword and the sacrificial knife. Fu Hao did. And when she died, her importance was sealed in stone, or more precisely, in earth. Her tomb, unearthed at Anyang in the 20th century, is one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the Shang Dynasty. Inside lay over 100 bronze vessels, hundreds of jade ornaments, ivory, and even the remains of human sacrifices buried to accompany her into the afterlife. This wasn't the burial of a secondary figure. It was the resting place of someone central to Shang power, honored with riches usually reserved for kings. But let's pause on that tomb for a second, because it tells us more than just Fu Hao's wealth. It tells us about the network she commanded. Every bronze vessel was the result of miners, smelters, mold makers, and artisans. Every jade piece came from distant quarries, transported through trade routes and carved with painstaking labor. The sacrifices buried with her represent the reach of her authority, the willingness of others to give life and death to honor her. That scale of tribute couldn't be faked. It was earned. Now, some might argue that Fu Hao was exceptional, a rare break in a male-dominated pattern. And yes, she was exceptional. But her very existence suggests that Shang society wasn't as rigidly closed to female power as later eras would become. The fact that a woman could rise so high, lead armies, and perform rituals at the highest level tells us the Shang weren't blind to confidence, regardless of gender. It was a more fluid world than the strict Confucian ideals that shaped later Chinese dynasties. Think about the impression she must have left on her contemporaries. A farmer hearing news of Fu Hao's victories might whisper her name in awe. A noble attending her rituals might measure his own power against hers, perhaps uneasily. And her husband, Wu Ding. He clearly saw her as more than a ceremonial partner. He trusted her with the lifeblood of his dynasty, war and ritual. Fu Hao's story isn't just a side note in Shang history. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, power could bend, twist, and surprise. It's also a crack in the wall of assumptions we build about gender in the past. Women were not always hidden figures. Sometimes, they stood at the very center of the storm, commanding respect with bronze in hand and prayers on their lips. So when we think of the Shang, don't picture only kings staring into the flames of oracle bones. Picture Fu Hao, too, warrior, priestess, queen, her legacy still shimmering from a tomb that lay hidden for millennia. If Fu Hao showed us that the Shang weren't afraid to put women at the head of armies, then the armies themselves reveal just how much muscle the dynasty wielded. Shang warfare wasn't random raiding, it was organized, ritualized, and shockingly advanced for its time. And the key to that military edge lay in bronze and in the thunder of chariots rolling across open fields. Start with the chariot, because it was a game-changer. Picture it, a two-wheeled vehicle drawn by horses, crewed by a driver and one or two warriors. To the tribes still fighting on foot, it must have looked like something out of the heavens. Fast, mobile, and terrifying, the chariot turned the battlefield into a stage for speed and shock. Archaeologists have found Shang chariot burials with full teams of horses laid to rest, a solemn reminder that these machines weren't just practical, they were sacred symbols of power. To own chariots was to show that you commanded both resources and the favor of heaven. Then there were the weapons. Bronze gave the Shang arsenal teeth sharper than their rivals could bite. Spears tipped with bronze, halberds, with wide blades that could hook and slash, axes, that doubled as both weapons and symbols of authority. These weren't crude tools. They were carefully cast, balanced, and designed for maximum effect. When you imagine a line of Shang soldiers advancing, their weapons gleaming in the sun, you can almost hear the clanging chorus of bronze striking bronze. That sound, harsh, metallic, final, must have sent shivers through enemy ranks. The army wasn't just elite warriors, though. It was structured. Common farmers were conscripted, called up to fight when campaigns demanded. Nobles brought their retainers, supplying men and supplies as part of their duty to the king. And at the top, generals, sometimes even queens like Fu Hao commanded. Battles weren't chaotic melees. They were coordinated affairs, often prefaced by divination to determine heaven's blessing. Soldiers didn't just fight, they fought with the knowledge that their actions were tied to the cosmic balance, that each swing of a halberd echoed the will of the ancestors. Ritual and war were inseparable. Before campaigns, sacrifices were made. After victories, prisoners were often killed in rituals, their blood sealing the dynasty's triumph. War wasn't just about territory, it was about reaffirming the Shang's place in the universe. That gave every soldier's death, every horse's gallop, a spiritual weight that went beyond strategy. But don't picture the Shang army as unstoppable. They fought constantly because their borders were constantly tested. Rival tribes weren't passive, they raided, resisted, sometimes even defeated Shang forces. The army's power had to be demonstrated again and again, not only to enemies, but to the Shang's own people, who needed proof that their king still carried heaven's mandate. Victories meant legitimacy, defeats cast shadows of doubt. And yet, the Shang did something few societies of their age managed. They made war both practical and sacred. On the practical side, their chariots, bronze weapons, and organized ranks gave them an edge in conquest. On the sacred side, the rituals surrounding every campaign turned warfare into an act of divine theater, reminding everyone that their dynasty's might wasn't just human, it was heavenly. Imagine standing on a battlefield at dawn, the ground trembling under the hooves of horses, the sun catching the shine of bronze blades. Priests chant at the rear, offering prayers to ancestors. The king, or maybe Fu Hao herself, stands in a chariot, ready to signal the charge. And then the army moves, a wave of bronze and blood, their thunder rolling into history. That was the Shang army, not just warriors, but a storm powered by bronze, chariots, and the unshakable belief that heaven itself rode with them. If you've been noticing a theme so far, it's this. In the Shang world, politics didn't stand apart from religion. They were fused together like copper and tin in a bronze mold. Kings didn't govern simply because they had soldiers or walls or treasure. They governed because they convinced people that the spirits, the ancestors, and heaven itself were behind them. In fact, you could almost say the Shang throne was built less on stone and more on ritual smoke and whispered prayers. Every Shang king had two faces, one as the political ruler who commanded armies, and the other as the high priest who mediated between the living and the dead. These roles weren't optional. To rule was to perform both. The king asked the ancestors when to wage war, when to plant crops, even when to hold festivals. Oracle bones weren't just religious tools, they were instruments of governance. A cracked turtle shell could steer an entire kingdom's policy. That's where the genius and the fragility of Shang politics comes in. By tying every decision to heaven's mandate, kings could claim legitimacy beyond dispute. If you were a noble unhappy with the king's tax demands, how could you argue if the oracle bone declared the ancestors approved? If you were a farmer questioning a new conscription, how could you object if the king said heaven had spoken? It was a neat system of control, one that merged faith and fear into obedience. But it cut both ways. Because if things went wrong, if the harvest failed, if floods drowned villages, if enemies broke through defenses, people didn't just blame chance. They questioned whether the king still had heaven's blessing. That's the double-edged sword of mixing politics with religion. Your power becomes immense, but so does your vulnerability. Success looks divine, failure looks like damnation. And the rituals weren't limited to divination. Every major political act was paired with sacrifice. Winning a war meant thanking the ancestors with blood. Building a city meant consecrating it through offerings. Even the enthronement of a new king was less about public proclamation and more about ritual affirmation, proving, in the eyes of both men and spirits, that heaven's will had passed from one ruler to the next. Without ritual, politics was incomplete. This blending shaped the structure of the Shang state itself. Nobles weren't just administrators, they were often priests too, leading rituals in their territories that mirrored those at the royal court. That made politics feel cosmic at every level. A noble sacrificing a pig in a village was echoing the king sacrificing humans at the capital. The hierarchy of society mirrored the hierarchy of the divine. It's worth pausing here to think about how unusual this was compared to other parts of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, kings built temples to appease the gods, but often ruled in their own name. In Egypt, pharaohs declared themselves gods outright. The Shang struck a middle ground. Kings weren't gods themselves, but they were indispensable conduits to the divine. That position made them both awe-inspiring and precarious. So, imagine the scene: a Shang king standing in front of his nobles, bronze vessels arrayed before him, the air thick with incense. He announces that the ancestors have spoken, rain will come, victory is assured, or the harvest will be strong. His words carry weight not because he's powerful, but because he claims they aren't his words at all. They belong to heaven. And with that, obedience follows. Religion didn't just shape Shang politics, it was Shang politics. The dynasty ruled not only through bronze and chariots, but through belief, binding people to the throne with chains that were invisible, yet stronger than iron. If the farmers carried the weight of survival, and the priests carried the weight of ritual, then the Shang elite carried something else entirely: the burden of showing off. Because in the world of the Shang, power wasn't quiet. It was loud, visible, and often soaked in wine. The nobility didn't just govern, they performed their status through banquets, feasts, and grand hunts that reminded everyone who sat at the top of the social pyramid. Let's start with the feasting. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous bronze vessels, cauldrons, wine cups, and food containers that tell us these weren't modest affairs. These weren't your simple village dinners around a cooking fire. These were spectacles of abundance. Millet wine flowed freely, poured from vessels so heavy it sometimes took two people to lift them. Meat, rare for commoners, was plentiful, roasted or stewed, often from animals killed in sacrifice. And the company? Nobles, warriors, priests, sometimes even captured rivals brought in to witness the grandeur of Shang luxury. The feasts weren't just about indulgence. They were political theater. Sharing wine and meat wasn't casual, it was a statement of hierarchy. The king might offer a cup of wine to a favored noble, signaling trust. A rival might be excluded, made to watch as others drink. Every bite, every sip, reinforced alliances and drew lines of loyalty. And beneath the laughter and music, the message was clear: power tastes good, and the Shang elite had plenty of it. Now, about the drinking. The Shang were serious about their alcohol. Millet wine wasn't only for feasts, it was woven into rituals, used to toast ancestors, and consumed as a daily pleasure among the elite. But excess drinking also became part of their image. Later stories accuse Shang rulers of drunkenness, of letting wine dull their judgment. It's hard to separate propaganda from truth here, but there's no question that drinking was both a privilege and a risk. It bound communities together, yes, but it also left the dynasty open to charges of decadence when things went wrong. Feasts often spilled into music and performance. Bronze bells and drums provided rhythm, dancers moved in practice steps, and poetry may have been recited aloud. For commoners, these moments were inaccessible. For nobles, they were central to their world, a chance to see and be seen, to affirm their place at the top, and to indulge in pleasures that reminded everyone of the gulf between elite and peasant life. And then there was hunting. To the Shang elite, hunting wasn't just about filling the larder with venison or boar, it was a performance of dominance. Kings and nobles led grand hunts, sometimes with hundreds of attendants, chasing game across forests and plains. Horses and chariots turned the hunt into a military exercise, training warriors while also showcasing wealth and strength. Bringing down a powerful animal was a demonstration of prowess, proof that the same men who commanded armies could also command the wild. Think about the symbolism: a king drawing a bow against a deer, or a noble thrusting a spear into a charging boar. These moments weren't just sport, they were metaphors for ruling itself. Master the hunt, master the land, master the people. And when the carcass was hauled back to the palace, it became another reason to feast, another display of abundance. Of course, from a modern perspective, it's easy to roll our eyes and say, well, they were just partying while others toiled. And in some sense, that's true. The farmers bent their backs in the fields while the nobles drained wine from ornate cups. But in the Shang worldview, these displays weren't waste, they were necessary. They were proof that the dynasty thrived, that the ancestors had blessed them, that their rulers lived in harmony with heaven's will. To eat lavishly, to drink deeply, to hunt triumphantly, these were acts of legitimacy, not just luxury. So picture it, a grand hall lit by fire, bronze vessels glinting, nobles laughing as wine sloshes in heavy cups, music echoing against the walls. Outside, the remnants of a great hunt hang as trophies. For the Shang elite, this wasn't frivolity. It was politics, ritual, and self-assertion rolled into one. And yet, you can almost sense the fragility in it. Because excess feasting can tip into decadence. Too much drinking can turn from power into weakness. Too much display can make the gap between ruler and ruled feel dangerously wide. The Shang elite walked that line constantly, reveling in their might, but also sowing the seeds of later criticism. On the surface, the Shang looked unshakable, kings in their chariots, bronzes gleaming in rituals, nobles feasting under heavy vessels of wine. But beneath that surface, the dynasty was always fragile. Power that rests on ritual and spectacle is dazzling, but it can also crack easily. And the cracks appeared in ways that were all too human: famines, rebellions, and nobles who were never entirely content to bow their heads. Let's start with the land, because in an agrarian society, the soil is destiny. A bad harvest could be catastrophic. Too much rain and fields flooded, too little and crops withered. Imagine being a farmer whose millet stalks shriveled under the summer sun, knowing your tribute to the Shang would still be demanded, whether you had enough to feed your family or not. That tension simmered at the very base of society. Famines didn't just mean hunger, they meant unrest. Hungry people are hard to control, and rumors of heaven's displeasure spread quickly when bellies were empty. Rebellions often flared at the edges of the Shang realm, where loyalty was more fragile. Remember, many tribes had been folded into the dynasty through conquest or diplomacy. Their loyalty was conditional, often more pragmatic than heartfelt. If the Shang king showed weakness, say, after a poor harvest or a failed battle, those groups might seize the moment to push back, refusing tribute, raiding Shang settlements, or outright declaring independence. Every rebellion was both a political and spiritual crisis, forcing the king to prove that heaven's favor had not abandoned him. And then there were the nobles, the restless lords whose power underpinned the dynasty, but who always carried the potential to fracture it. The Shang kings couldn't rule alone. They relied on a network of allied families who controlled their own territories, gathered tribute, and raised soldiers. But the same system that gave the dynasty reach also bred instability. Ambitious nobles might decide they were just as fit as the king to claim heaven's mandate. Too much central control could spark resentment, too little allowed local rulers to drift toward independence. Balancing that relationship was a constant tightrope walk. Think about the pressure on a Shang king. He had to perform rituals perfectly, win wars decisively, keep nobles loyal, and pray the weather didn't betray him. Failure on any front could be interpreted as cosmic disfavor. And once whispers began that heaven no longer smiled on the dynasty, it became harder to contain unrest. It wasn't just politics. It was faith unraveling. Archaeology even gives us glimpses of these struggles. Some oracle bones show kings asking desperate questions. Will the drought end? Should we sacrifice more cattle? Will the enemy raid us again? You can feel the anxiety etched into those cracks. These weren't invincible rulers. They were men trying to hold together a fragile order, looking to the ancestors for reassurance they might not have felt themselves. And of course, famine, rebellion, and noble restlessness fed into each other. A bad harvest weakened central authority. A weakened authority emboldened nobles. Nobles pulling away encouraged border tribes to raid. Raids and revolts drained resources, making it harder to recover from famine. It was a cycle that could spiral quickly, reminding everyone that the Shang's splendor was balanced on a knife's edge. Imagine a villager during one of those years of crisis. You've given up part of your harvest as tribute, but now your own family is starving. You hear rumors of unrest at the borders, of nobles whispering disloyalty, of sacrifices increasing as the king grows desperate. Do you still believe the dynasty is chosen by heaven? Or do you wonder if the mandate is slipping away? Those doubts, whispered in huts and fields, were just as dangerous as enemy armies. So while the Shang dazzled with bronze and ritual, their glory was never absolute. It always carried fragility beneath it, fragility that would, in time, widen into cracks too deep to repair. Every dynasty eventually reaches a point where the very things that once made it strong begin to drag it down. For the Shang, that turning point came when war and ritual, their two pillars of power, started to overburden the state. At their height, constant campaigns and elaborate ceremonies had showcased Shang might. But over time, they became costly habits, draining resources, testing loyalty, and pushing the dynasty toward exhaustion. Let's take war first. The Shang had built their reputation on conquest, on bronze weapons and chariots that thundered across battlefields. But wars are expensive. Horses had to be bred and fed, soldiers conscripted, bronze smelted into weapons rather than tools. Every campaign demanded grain, labor, and sacrifice, not just in lives lost on the field, but in the toil of those who supported them back home. Victories brought tribute, yes, but endless wars also meant endless strains. And when victory slowed, or when battles were indecisive, the balance sheet of war tilted toward debt rather than profit. Then there was ritual, the other side of Shang power. If war kept enemies at bay, ritual kept heaven on their side. But those ceremonies grew heavier and heavier over time. Imagine the scale: massive bronze vessels cast just for one sacrifice, thousands of animals slaughtered, and in some cases, human lives taken in elaborate displays meant to appease the ancestors. Each ritual required enormous resources: grain, wine, bronze, labor. What once had been a powerful statement of authority began to look like a weight crushing the very people meant to sustain the dynasty. And the irony is almost painful. The more crises the Shang faced, the more they doubled down on ritual. Famine? More sacrifices. Rebellion? More offerings. Defeat in battle? More ceremonies to beg the ancestors for favor. But each response drained resources further, creating a vicious cycle. It's like a gambler doubling down on losses. Rituals meant to save the dynasty may have hastened its decline. The nobles must have felt the strain acutely. They were expected to contribute to both wars and rituals, sending soldiers and supplies while also providing offerings for ceremonies. Loyalty turned into resentment when obligations became unbearable. And as nobles grumbled, the cracks widened. Some began withholding tribute, others shifted allegiance quietly toward rising powers like the Zhou. The same elite who had once strengthened the Shang now began to weigh them down. And what about ordinary people? Imagine being a farmer already stretched thin by drought, only to see grain taken for sacrifices or armies. You watch your cattle driven off to become offerings, while your own children go hungry. Rituals that were supposed to protect you start to feel like burdens. It's not hard to imagine resentment growing, whispers spreading that perhaps the king had lost heaven's favor, that perhaps the Shang mandate had already slipped away. Even the oracle bones tell part of this story. Late in the Shang era, they reveal increasingly anxious questions. Will the harvest recover? Will heaven punish us? Will the sacrifices be enough? That tone of desperation shows a dynasty leaning harder and harder on rituals it could barely sustain. It's almost tragic, really. The Shang had built their dynasty on war and ritual, and for centuries, those strategies worked. They expanded territory, legitimized kingship, and bound people together in shared belief. But the same formulas that gave them strength eventually turned into shackles. By the time the Shang realized it, they were already stretched thin, an empire bleeding resources, unable to slow the pace of wars or reduce the scale of rituals without admitting weakness. That's the paradox of the Shang's decline. The very foundations of their power became the cracks in their walls. They couldn't afford to stop fighting, and they couldn't afford to stop sacrificing. But in trying to keep both going, they wore themselves down until there was little left to defend. Every dynasty that lasts long enough eventually writes the same tragic script. The vigor of its founding gives way to the rot of its twilight. For the Shang, that rot showed itself in the court, where corruption crept in like a slow fog and stories of excess began to define the kings more than their victories. The problem wasn't just politics, it was perception. Once people started whispering that the rulers cared more about indulgence than duty, heaven's mandate began to feel shaky. Let's picture the court of the late Shang. What had once been a place of ritual gravitas and political decision-making began to lean more heavily on pleasure. Feasts that once cemented alliances grew gaudy. Wine, once sacred in ritual, became a daily indulgence in excess. The vessels unearthed from late Shang tombs are larger, more ornate, almost flaunting luxury for its own sake. Archaeologists see artistry, contemporaries might have seen gluttony. And then there's the story of Dxin, the last Shang king, who later histories painted as the very embodiment of corruption. Was he really as cruel and debauched as the tales claim? Hard to say. History is written by victors in this case, the Zhou, who had every reason to make their enemy look monstrous. But the story stuck, and they're telling in themselves. Dxin was accused of building a lake filled with wine, an absurd symbol of indulgence, and creating a meat forest where trees supposedly dripped with skewered flesh for feasting. Whether true or not, these tales framed him as a ruler who turned resources into spectacle while his people struggled. And it wasn't just excess in food and drink. The court became known for corruption, nobles bribing their way into favor, officials enriching themselves at the expense of commoners. Tribute meant for the dynasty's stability often ended up lining the pockets of courtiers or fueling extravagant displays. The machinery of governance faltered as loyalty was bought and sold rather than earned. Now, here's the thing. A dynasty can survive hardship if the people still believe their rulers are trying. But when rulers appear wasteful while famine gnaws at the countryside, the faith unravels. The rituals lose their meaning. The king's sacrifices to the ancestors begin to look hollow when the people can barely sacrifice enough to feed their families. And once the idea takes root that the court is corrupt, every failure, military, agricultural, or spiritual, feels like proof. The nobles, too, felt the strain. Many had grown resentful of the king's excess, especially as demands for tribute and soldiers grew heavier while rewards diminished. Some likely wondered aloud, why should we bleed for a ruler who feasts while we scrape? It's a dangerous thought, because once nobles start thinking that way, they're already halfway toward rebellion, or at least toward shifting their allegiance to someone stronger, like the rising Zhou. So imagine the contrast. In the villages, farmers tighten belts through another lean year, children crying for food. In the capital, the king drinks from a vessel so heavy it takes 2 servants to lift. Music fills the palace while silence fills the fields. That gulf between ruler and ruled isn't just material, it's spiritual. It makes people question not only the king's leadership, but heaven's endorsement of his reign. Even if the stories of Dxin's wine lake and meat forest are exaggerations, they captured a truth that mattered more than the details. The Shang court, in its final days, seemed more concerned with excess than with survival. And in Chinese history, once a dynasty earns that reputation, the fall is never far behind. While the Shang court drowned itself in wine and ritual, beyond its borders, another force was gathering strength. The Zhou. At first, they were just one of many tribal groups orbiting the Shang sphere, sending tribute when necessary, fighting skirmishes when forced. But unlike others, the Zhou were patient. They watched. They learned. And slowly, quietly, they built themselves into the kind of rival that could challenge a dynasty. The Zhou homeland lay to the west, on the fringes of Shang territory. Their land was less fertile, more rugged, a frontier compared to the Shang heartland along the Yellow River. But that frontier environment shaped them. It gave them resilience, a knack for survival in harsher conditions. Their leaders grew adept at balancing farming with herding, war with diplomacy. They weren't weighed down by the same heavy rituals and excess that bound the Shang court. To put it simply, while the Shang grew complacent, the Zhou grew tough. What's striking is how the Zhou adapted Shang practices even as they prepared to challenge them. They learned the ritual system, incorporating ancestor worship into their own culture. They trained in the use of chariots, absorbing the military innovations that had once made the Shang invincible. They observed the political machinery of tribute and alliances and began replicating it on a smaller scale in their own sphere of influence. In a sense, They were students of the Shang, but students who planned to surpass their masters. And they didn't just build in isolation. The Zhou forged alliances with other discontented groups on the Shang periphery. Where the Shang demanded tribute and obedience, the Zhou offered partnership, or at least the promise of fairer treatment. Little by little, they gathered strength not only in numbers but in reputation. To restless nobles, the Zhou began to look like an alternative center of gravity, one that might soon rival the Shang throne. Meanwhile, Shang kings underestimated them. In their eyes, the Zhou were just another frontier tribe, useful for tribute and manpower, not a real threat. But that arrogance was costly. The Zhou used the time to expand, to train, and to prepare. They bided their time, waiting for the moment when Shang weakness would become undeniable. And here's where it gets poetic. The Zhou turned the Shang's own ideology against them. The idea of the mandate of heaven, that rulers held power only so long as they governed justly, was sharpened into a weapon. If heaven granted the mandate, it could also take it away. The Zhou argued that the Shang, with their corruption, cruelty, and excess, had lost heaven's blessing. And guess who heaven favored now? The Zhou, of course. It was a brilliant move. They didn't just rebel, they claimed cosmic legitimacy for their rebellion. So imagine the atmosphere in those years. In the Shang capital, rituals grew louder, sacrifices larger, as kings tried to drown out whispers of decline. But in the West, the Zhou trained soldiers, forged alliances, and told their people a different story, that the Shang's time had ended and a new dynasty was rising. The Zhou weren't rushing headlong into rebellion. They were building patiently, brick by brick, until the moment came when Shang fragility and Zhou strength would collide. And when that moment came, the world of the Shang would never be the same again. Tension had been building for years, maybe decades. On one side stood the Shang, once glorious, now weighed down by ritual excess, court corruption, and nobles who no longer hid their restlessness. On the other stood the Zhou, disciplined, ambitious, and increasingly confident that heaven was on their side. When the two forces finally collided, it wasn't just a war of armies. It was a war of worldviews, Shang arrogance against Zhou ambition. The Shang kings, especially Xian in the end, underestimated their Western rivals. They saw the Zhou as upstarts, frontier folk who could be kept in line with occasional shows of force. But here's the problem: arrogance blinds. The Shang thought their ritual grandeur, their bronze vessels, and their centuries-old dynasty made them untouchable. They didn't realize that the very weight of those traditions had become a liability. Meanwhile, the Zhou prepared carefully. They built their military strength, not just in numbers but in organization. They honed their use of chariots, learned the value of discipline, and rallied allies dissatisfied with Shang rule. Other tribes and noble families, weary of Shang demands, began to listen when the Zhou whispered that the dynasty had lost heaven's mandate. Slowly, the Zhou ambition spread like a fire catching dry grass. The clash wasn't immediate. It simmered in raids, skirmishes, and political maneuvering. At times, the Zhou even played the role of loyal tributaries, sending gifts to the Shang court, all the while building their own power base in the West. But beneath the surface, they were sharpening their swords, literally and figuratively, for the decisive break. And it wasn't just politics or military might. The Zhou ambition was ideological. They framed themselves as moral reformers, warriors of justice rising against a corrupt dynasty. They claimed that heaven had withdrawn its blessing from the Shang, disgusted by their cruelty, indulgence, and failures. It's one thing to fight a king. It's another to say you're fighting on behalf of heaven itself. That framing gave their rebellion a force beyond steel and bronze. It gave it inevitability. The Shang, for their part, leaned harder into arrogance. Xian in particular is remembered, fairly or not, as a king so consumed by excess that he couldn't see the danger rising at his borders. His court lived in spectacle, feasting while the countryside strained under tribute. He punished dissent harshly, alienating nobles who might have otherwise defended him. And when word of Zhou's strength reached him, he dismissed it, convinced that centuries of Shang rule made his dynasty eternal. So, picture it, the Zhou armies gathering, disciplined ranks of warriors, chariots lined up, allies swelling their numbers. Priests stand with them, declaring that heaven itself marches at their side. Across the field, the Shang forces assemble, still powerful but weighed down by resentment, corruption, and soldiers who may not believe in their cause. On the eve of battle, both sides perform sacrifices. Both sides seek heaven's favor. But only one side carries the conviction that heaven has already chosen them. The clash wasn't just a military confrontation, it was the turning of an age. The Shang fought to preserve the old order, while the Zhou fought to birth a new one. When arrogance meets ambition, history tends to side with the hungrier, the more disciplined, the more determined. And in this case, the Zhou had all three. What followed would not just be a battle, but the unraveling of a dynasty. Every dynasty has its breaking point, and for the Shang, it came on a battlefield known as Mai. If earlier clashes between Shang and Zhou had been skirmishes and tests of will, Mai was the moment of decision, the day when centuries of rule cracked in an instant. What makes it unforgettable is not just the fighting itself, but the way the battle turned into a living symbol of heaven's mandate shifting hands. The Zhou king at the time, King Wu, marshaled his forces carefully. He didn't rush headlong into confrontation. Instead, he built a coalition. Allies from tribes disillusioned with Shang arrogance joined him, swelling his numbers far beyond what the Shang court expected. The army he brought to Mai wasn't just Zhou, it was a tapestry of discontent, proof that Shang dominance had frayed badly. On the Shang side, Dxian, the last Shang king, gathered a massive force. Accounts describe hundreds of thousands, though those numbers are likely inflated by later historians. Still, it's clear the Shang brought sheer size to the field. Chariots, soldiers, conscripts, many pressed into service unwillingly, stood under banners that had once struck fear across the land. But numbers don't always tell the full story. Morale matters. And the Shang army's heart wasn't in it. The sources tell us something astonishing. When the battle began, large parts of the Shang army defected. Some switched sides outright, joining the Zhou. Others simply dropped their weapons and walked away. Imagine that moment, the clash of bronze spears, the thunder of chariots, and then, suddenly, whole lines crumbling not because they were defeated, but because they no longer believed. It wasn't just an army breaking, it was faith in the dynasty dissolving in real time. The Zhou seized the moment. Their forces pressed forward, disciplined, unified, carrying with them not just weapons, but the conviction that heaven itself marched alongside. Against that kind of belief, the Shang's hollow numbers couldn't hold. The battlefield turned into a rout, Zhou chariots slicing through disorganized Shang ranks, warriors chanting as they closed in on the capital's defenders. And what of Dxian, the last Shang king? The stories say he retreated to his palace after the defeat, surrounded by his treasures. Realizing the end had come, he built a pyre, climbed atop it, and set it ablaze, burning himself alive rather than face capture. Whether that detail is fact or later moral storytelling, it captures the sense of collapse. A dynasty that had lived in fire and ritual ended in flames. The Battle of Mai wasn't just a military turning point. It was a cosmic one. In the Zhou narrative, it was the proof that heaven had abandoned the Shang. How else to explain entire regiments defecting mid-battle? How else to explain the collapse of a dynasty so quickly, so decisively? For the Zhou, Mai became the ultimate validation of the mandate of heaven, a story retold again and again in later Chinese history as the model for righteous rebellion. Imagine standing on that field after the dust settled. Broken chariots litter the ground, bronze weapons glint in the sun, corpses lie where lines once stood. And in the silence after battle, the realization sets in. The Shang, rulers for centuries, are finished. The Zhou, once frontier upstarts, now hold the mandate. In a single day, the axis of power had shifted. That's the power of Mai, not just as a battle, but as a turning point where ambition toppled arrogance, where soldiers voted with their feet, and where fate, as the Zhou told it, swung fast and sharp in their favor. The Battle of Mai may have been the dramatic climax, but dynasties don't truly vanish in a single day. The Shang didn't disappear in one stroke of bronze spears or in the flames of Xian's pyre. Collapse is always messier, slower, more uneven. After Mai, the Shang world unraveled piece by piece, like a garment tugged at from too many angles until the threads gave way. For starters, not every Shang loyalist laid down arms immediately. Some nobles still clung to the dynasty, retreating to their fortresses, hoping to rally resistance. But their numbers were too few, their faith too shaken. The Zhou, fresh from victory, moved quickly to consolidate power, absorbing Shang territories and bringing wavering nobles into their orbit. Those who resisted were crushed, those who bent the knee were rewarded with a place in the new order. It was practical politics, the same strategy the Shang themselves had once used when building their power centuries earlier. And then there were the people, the farmers, artisans, and slaves who had supported the dynasty in their quiet, unglamorous ways. For them, collapse wasn't an abstract concept. It was the sudden shift of authority. One season, they carried grain to the Shang granaries. The next, they were told the Zhou now demanded tribute. Did they mourn the fall of the Shang? Some may have. But most probably kept their heads down and adjusted, as ordinary people always do when empires rise and fall. Their lives were tied less to dynastic names than to the eternal struggle of planting and harvest. Still, the Shang identity didn't vanish. Ritual centers still stood, bronzes still gleamed in ancestral halls, and some lines of the Shang royal family were allowed to survive under Zhou supervision. The Zhou, clever in their politics, didn't erase the Shang completely. They turned surviving Shang elites into ritual caretakers, assigning them the task of continuing sacrifices to their ancestors. It was both a gesture of respect and a way of neutralizing potential rebellion. By keeping the Shang nobility busy with ritual duties, the Zhou ensured they remained politically harmless while symbolically useful. This arrangement tells us something profound. Collapse is rarely total destruction. It's transformation. The Shang as rulers ended, but the Shang as a cultural presence lingered. Their bronzes were still used, their rituals still performed, their names still remembered. In that sense, the fall of the dynasty was less an obliteration than a fading, their glory dimming as the Zhou's star rose brighter. And yet, in memory, the fall loomed large. Later historians painted the Shang's decline as inevitable, a morality tale about corruption, arrogance, and loss of heaven's favor. The truth was more complicated. Yes, Mai was decisive. But the dynasty's collapse had been coming for years, built from famine, rebellion, court excess, and restless nobles. Mai was the spark that lit the tinder, but the fire had been smoldering for a long time. So when we talk about the end of the Shang, we shouldn't imagine it as a guillotine blade falling in an instant. It was more like a slow crumbling, a dynasty unraveling from the inside until an external push toppled what remained. Even after the Zhou took over, echoes of Shang power still haunted the land, lingering in rituals, stories, and artifacts. The dynasty was gone, but it wasn't forgotten. That slow fade is why the Shang story feels so human. It wasn't just about kings and battles. It was about how people adjust, how cultures morph, and how even in defeat, remnants endure. When the Zhou victory became final, the Shang didn't just lose a battle or a throne. They lost the very structures that had defined their identity, the ritual centers where kings spoke to the ancestors, the cities that pulsed with feasts and ceremonies, and the royal lines that once seemed eternal. It was more than political defeat, it was cultural dismantling. Start with the ritual centers. The Shang capital at Anyang had been a sacred hub, filled with temples, altars, and ancestral halls. The smell of burning offerings and the gleam of bronze vessels defined its air. But once the Zhou asserted dominance, many of those centers were abandoned or repurposed. The sacrificial pits grew cold, the drums stopped beating, and the oracle bones, once alive with questions to heaven, were buried and forgotten. To lose those centers was to lose the beating heart of Shang authority, because without ritual, kingship had no stage. The cities followed. Shang settlements, especially the great walled cities, had symbolized order and strength. They were where nobles gathered, artisans cast bronzes, and feasts showcased power. But after the fall, many of those cities declined. Some were destroyed outright in conflict. Others simply emptied, their people shifting allegiance and labor toward new Zhou centers of power. The walls that had once marked Shang dominance became silent ruins, crumbling slowly under wind and rain. Archaeologists uncover them now, foundations of palaces, charred remains, scattered bronzes, but in their time, they must have felt like the ghosts of a dynasty that had lost its purpose. And then there were the royal lines. For centuries, Shang kings had claimed the mandate, tracing legitimacy through ancestral worship. After that lineage shattered. Some royals were executed, others fled, and some were kept alive under Zhou watch. The Zhou, clever as always, didn't exterminate the Shang family completely. They allowed branches of the royal clan to survive, but as ritual servants, caretakers of ancestral sacrifices rather than wielders of political power. It was a symbolic demotion, from rulers of men to servants of memory. To the Zhou, it was a way of neutralizing their rivals while still honoring the past. To the Shang, it must have felt like humiliation. But loss isn't only about structures and titles, it's about identity. Imagine being a noble born into the Shang royal house, raised with the belief that you carried heaven's mandate, only to find yourself stripped of authority, performing sacrifices at the command of your conquerors. Or think of an artisan who once cast bronzes for Shang kings, now reworking molds for Zhou patrons. The shift wasn't just political. It was personal, felt in every life that had once been tied to the Shang name. And what about the ordinary people? Their losses were subtler but no less real. The festivals that once marked their calendar changed. The rituals they attended shifted focus. The stories their elders told of great Shang kings communing with ancestors sounded more like echoes than certainties. The Shang world was fading, not only in palaces and altars, but in memory, as a new dynasty wrote itself into the landscape. Of course, not everything vanished. The Shang script survived, carried forward by the Zhou. Bronze casting continued, though the styles evolved. Ancestor worship remained central. But those continuities only sharpen the sense of loss, because they show what the Shang didn't get to keep, the ownership of their own traditions. Their culture lived on, but under someone else's name, folded into a new order where the Shang themselves were no longer at the center. What was lost was more than buildings, vessels, or lineages. What was lost was a dynasty's claim to matter in the present. They had become, in a sense, history while still alive, a fading echo, overshadowed by the Zhou's rising chorus. The Shang may have lost their throne, their cities, and their mandate, but they didn't vanish into nothing. Pieces of their world remained, fragments so powerful that thousands of years later, they still speak. In some ways, what the Shang left behind tells us more about them than the chronicles written by their successors. Start with the bones, the oracle bones. Buried for millennia, forgotten under layers of earth, they resurfaced in the late 19th century in the most unexpected way, ground up and sold as dragon bones in traditional medicine. Only when scholars noticed the strange carvings did the truth emerge. These weren't mere fossils. They were the earliest records of Chinese writing, questions carved by Shang kings to their ancestors. Today, those bones are studied like treasure, carrying the voices of a dynasty that otherwise might have been dismissed as myth. The fact that they survive is astonishing. Fragile, cracked, blackened by fire, they still whisper of fears and hopes. Will it rain? Will we win? Will the child be safe? Questions as human now as they were then. Then there are the bronzes. Heavy, ornate, covered with patterns that stare back at you with stylized eyes and curling dragon forms. They outlived the dynasty that cast them, resting in tombs until archaeologists lifted them into the light. They weren't just vessels, they were art, technology, and symbols of power all at once. To hold a Shang bronze, even in a museum, is to feel the weight not only of metal but of belief. The Taodai masks carved on their surfaces still baffle us. Were they meant to ward off evil, to embody ancestors, to symbolize abundance? Whatever their meaning, they give the Shang an aura of mystery that no conquest could erase. And then, the whispers, the stories passed down through Zhou chronicles, Confucian texts, and later histories. The Shang were remembered not only for their glory but for their failings, kings who grew cruel, nobles who feasted too much, rulers who drown themselves in wine and excess. Whether exaggerated or true, those whispers shaped the Shang's legacy. They became a cautionary tale, the classic example of how dynasties fall when they forget virtue. Ironically, the Zhou who overthrew them ensured the Shang would be remembered forever, not as faceless rulers of a forgotten age, but as the dynasty whose rise and fall taught China the lesson of heaven's mandate. But beyond the whispers of moral decline, there's another kind of survival: continuity. The Zhou didn't erase Shang traditions. They absorbed them. Ancestral worship, bronze ritual vessels, even the notion of the mandate of heaven, all these carried forward. The Shang remained in the DNA of Chinese civilization, not as rulers, but as ancestors themselves. In a sense, the entire culture became their descendant. And so the Shang linger, not as a living dynasty, but as traces, bones carved with anxious questions, bronzes gleaming with ancient fire, stories told around hearths and in texts for centuries after. To stand in front of those artifacts today is to feel the echo of their world, not whole, not intact, but present. They remind us that no dynasty ever truly disappears. It leaves behind pieces, sometimes material, sometimes invisible, that shape the world long after its banners have fallen. The Shang were lost, but they were never gone. Their bones, bronzes, and whispers keep them alive, a vanished age still murmuring across thousands of years.